There is a house in the Wiltshire downland, 4 miles south of Warminster, where the wind comes off Clay Hill in a long, unbroken sweep that smells of grass and chalk, and in autumn of the small wood smoke rising from the gamekeeper's cottages tucked into the folds of the park. You come down through 9,000 acres of capability brown landscape, past beech avenues planted in 1758, past a chain of artificial lakes engineered to catch the light of a Wiltshire afternoon, past a herd of fallow deer that has lived here continuously since the reign of Elizabeth I, and you crest a low rise, and the house appears in the valley below you, 3 stories of golden Bath ashlar. 96 windows of identical size, set in a perfectly symmetrical facade, a great open central court, towers and turrets rising from the roofline like the masts of a stone ship, the longest unbroken Elizabethan facade in England, built between 1567 and 1580 by a man whose father had been a small Somerset lawyer. This is Longleat House. What you are looking at is the first true prodigy house in English architecture, the building that taught England how to be Elizabethan, the house that Robert Smythson, then a young master mason from the West Country, designed before he went on to build Hardwick and Wollerton and the entire visual language of the Jacobean country house, the house that cost Sir John Thynne £8,016 in 1580, the equivalent of more than £20 million today, drawn from the spoils of dissolved monasteries and the favour of a Lord Protector, the house that has stood here for 459 years in the same valley, on the foundations of a vanished Augustinian priory under the same family, without interruption since the day the last stone was laid. Not just a country house, not just an estate, not just a tourist attraction. Longleat is where a 17th century heir was murdered in broad daylight on Pall Mall by 3 hired assassins, where the first stately home in England opened its doors to paying visitors in 1949, where the first drive-through safari park outside Africa was launched in 1966, where a marquess painted 70 explicit erotic murals across the walls of his own house, kept 75 mistresses in cottages around the estate, and where his son, in 2010, evicted every one of them and locked his father out of the building his ancestors had built. If you find these deep investigations into Britain's great houses and the hidden lives within them worth your time, please subscribe to this channel, leave a comment telling me which estate we should explore next, and help these stories reach the audience they deserve. It begins with a Tudor steward and a dissolved priory. In 1540, in the chambers of Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, and Lord Protector to the boy King Edward VI, a small, sharp-eyed lawyer named John Thynne held the position of steward. Thynne was the son of Thomas Thynne of Stretton, a Shropshire yeoman of no particular consequence. He had risen, as men did in that decade, through paperwork. He had drafted the leases by which the great religious houses of England were broken up and their land redistributed. He had watched the wealth of the abbeys flow through his ledgers into the hands of his patron, and he had taken his cut. By the early 1540s, he was a man of considerable private fortune, looking for somewhere to plant it. He found Longleat Priory. The Augustinian house at Longleat had been dissolved in 1539. The priory church had been pulled down, the canons pensioned off, the land granted to a Carthusian named John Horsey, who had no use for it. In 1541, Thynne bought the freehold for £53. He demolished what was left of the cloisters. He built a modest house against the ruined priory walls. He married Christian Gresham, niece of the founder of the Royal Exchange, and brought her down from London with a dowry that paid for the first wing. And then, in 1547, Edward VI died, Somerset fell from power, and John Thynne was arrested. He spent 18 months in the Tower of London. He came out in 1549 with his fortune intact, his patron dead on the scaffold, and a profound understanding that wealth without a house to display it was nothing. He set about expanding the modest building at Longleat. He bought adjoining manors. He drained the marshy ground south of the Priory Church. He had carts of Bath stone hauled along the chalk roads from the quarries at Box and Combe Down, 15 miles to the north. By 1566, he had spent a further £2,000 on a building that, even by the modest expectations of the Tudor gentry, was considered awkward in plan and undistinguished in elevation. He was 61 years old. He had spent 25 years on a house he did not yet think was worthy of the fortune that paid for it. And then, in April 1567, a fire destroyed most of the building he had so far constructed. Thynne saw the fire as an opportunity. He hired Robert Smythson, a young mason from Yorkshire who had been working on the Longford Castle Commission, and he gave him an instruction unprecedented in English architecture. Build me a house that looks the same from every angle. Build me a facade that does not hide its symmetry behind towers and gatehouses and barbicans. Build me a Renaissance palace in the Wiltshire chalk. Smythson did. Between 1567 and 1580, he raised, course by course, the Longleat we know today. 3 stories of perfectly cut Bath ashlar, golden in summer light, grey in November rain. 96 windows of equal size, ranged in horizontal bands, with mullioned tracery, and a glazing so extravagant that contemporaries called it a lantern house. A flat roofline, studded with banqueting houses and statues, a central court that brought light into the heart of the building. The total cost, recorded in Thynne's own building accounts, came to £8,016, 2 shillings and 8 pence. Sir John Thynne died in 1580, within a year of the house being finished. He never saw the gardens completed. He was buried in the parish church of Longbridge Deverill, 3 miles from the house, in a tomb that records his service to the Duke of Somerset, and makes no mention of where the building costs came from. He left behind a son, John II, who had married well. He left behind a house that already, by 1581, was being called the most beautiful in England. The Thynnes prospered through the 17th century. They were the kind of dynasty that knew how to survive without attracting attention. They sat for Wiltshire in 5 successive parliaments. They married daughters of judges, sons of bishops, cousins of admirals. They kept out of the Civil War where they could. And when they could not, the second Sir Thomas Thynne raised a regiment of foot for the king in 1643 and quietly withdrew it from the field at Roundway Down before any of his tenants could be killed. He compounded with Parliament after Naseby for £800 and kept Longleat untouched. His son added a long gallery in 1659 in anticipation of the Restoration, and when Charles II rode through Wiltshire in July 1660, the king stopped at Longleat for a single night, slept in the south chamber, and left the family with a verbal promise of a barony that was never written down. They sat in Parliament. They married heiresses. They added a long gallery, a great hall, a chapel. By 1670, the family was led by Sir Thomas Thynne, a man of property, and his only son and heir, also called Thomas. The younger Thomas was 8 years old when his father died. He grew up at Longleat, schooled by tutors, surrounded by the largest collection of Italian paintings west of London. By the age of 25, he was the master of an estate worth £10,000 a year, a sum that earned him in the coffee houses of Restoration London the nickname Tom of 10,000. He was tall, handsome, and dissolute. He had a London townhouse on Pall Mall, directly opposite St James's Palace. He kept a string of running horses at Newmarket. He was a close friend of the Duke of Monmouth, the king's illegitimate son, and he had subscribed £3,000 to the Monmouth cause in the winter of 1680. He drank in the Cocoa Tree. He gambled at Wills. He was, by the standards of his cousins, one of the most visible young heirs in Restoration London, and in the summer of 1681, he made the decision that would kill him. He married Elizabeth Percy. Elizabeth was 14 years old. She was the only surviving heiress of the Percy estate, the granddaughter of the Earl of Northumberland, the richest unmarried woman in England. She had already been married once, at the age of 12, to the Earl of Ogle, who had died within months. She was now, in 1681, being courted by half the great families of Europe. Among them was a Swedish count called Karl Johan von Konigsmark, a soldier of fortune who had served at Tangier and who had spent the spring of 1681 in London on what he described as a matter of personal urgency. Konigsmark believed that Elizabeth Percy had been promised to him. He was mistaken. On the evening of the 12th of February, 1682, Thomas Thynne was driving back to his Pall Mall house in a coach drawn by 6 horses. It was already dark. He had spent the afternoon at a tavern off the Strand. The coach turned into Pall Mall just past 9 o'clock in the evening, and 3 men on horseback rode out of the shadows of the Haymarket. One was a Polish soldier called Christopher Borowski, hired in Hamburg. One was a German captain called Christopher Wratz. The third was a Swedish lieutenant called John Stern. Wratz drew a blunderbuss and fired 4 slugs into the body of Thomas Thynne through the door of the coach. Thynne died the following morning at his own dining table, attended by 2 surgeons who could do nothing for him. He was 24 years old. The 3 assassins were caught within 48 hours. They confessed in their separate cells that they had been hired by Count Konigsmark, who was waiting at a coffee house at Charing Cross to hear the news. Konigsmark was arrested. He was tried separately at the Old Bailey on February 28, 1682, and by means that have never been fully explained, he was acquitted. The 3 killers were not. Borowski, Wratz, and Stern were hanged at Tyburn on March 10th, 1682. Their bodies were left to swing for 3 days. Wratz's body was afterwards displayed in chains on a gibbet at Hampstead Heath. The English public, led by the news sheets and the pamphleteers, was outraged. The Earl of Anglesey wrote in his diary that the acquittal of Konigsmark was a stain on the English bench. William Hogarth, a generation later, would paint the trial. The murder of Tom of 10,000 on Pall Mall in February 1682 became one of the founding scandals of Restoration England. Elizabeth Percy was widowed for the second time at 15. She married a third husband, the Duke of Somerset, 6 months later. She lived to be 65. She never spoke of Thomas Thynne in any surviving letter. Konigsmark fled to Sweden, then to Greece, and died fighting the Turks at Argos in August 1686, 4 years after the murder. His body was returned to Stockholm and buried in the Ridderholm Church. Samuel Pepys, who had retired from public life by 1682, but who kept a private commonplace book, recorded on the 13th of February 1682 only this: a great gentleman of Wiltshire shot in his coach this night past in Pall Mall, the town in an uproar, money at the bottom of it, and a woman. The verbatim line survives in the Pepys papers in the Bodleian. Hogarth's painting of the trial, completed in 1730 and now in a private collection in Yorkshire, shows Konigsmark in profile, white-coated, hand resting on the rail of the dock, looking out at the viewer. The Thynne title passed to Thomas's cousin, also called Thomas, who in May 1682 was created Viscount Weymouth as compensation for the loss the family had suffered. A century later, in 1789, the title was elevated again, and the Thynnes became Marquesses of Bath. By the time we reached the 20th century, the family had held Longleat for 10 generations and survived every catastrophe English aristocracy could throw at it. And then they confronted the one catastrophe they could not survive on their own. They confronted the bill. The 5th Marquess of Bath died in 1946. The death duties came to £700,000. The 6th Marquess, Henry Frederick Thynne, born in 1905, inherited an estate that on paper was worth millions and in cash was worth almost nothing. The house had been requisitioned during the war as the wartime home of the Royal School at Bath. 300 girls had been billeted in the staterooms. The library had been used as a refectory. The old master paintings had been crated and moved to the cellars of the chapel. When Henry walked back into Longleat in October, 1945, he found the parquet of the saloon scarred by the iron feet of trestle tables and the gilt mouldings of the dining room cornice flaking in long pale strips onto a covered floor. The roof was leaking in 3 places. The staterooms had not been painted since 1922. The garden staff had been cut from 48 to 7. The London townhouse had already been sold. There was a real and serious conversation in the family in 1947 about handing Longleat to the National Trust and walking away. Henry refused. He had another idea. On 1st April 1949, after 18 months of preparation, the 6th Marquess of Bath opened Longleat to the paying public. Admission was 2 shillings and 6pence. There was a small tea room in what had been the gun room. There was a guidebook written by the Marquess himself in his own slightly archaic prose, explaining the history of the family and the paintings on the walls. The first day's takings were £40. The newspapers covered it as a stunt. One Peter wrote to the Times to say that the sight of trippers tramping through a stately home was a vulgarity. The Duke of Bedford, watching from Woburn, took notes. Within 5 years, almost every great house in England was charging admission. Longleat was the first. It was not enough. By 1965, the visitor numbers were declining, and the operating costs were rising. The 6th Marquess began looking for what he called a second engine. He found it in a Newmarket trainer named Jimmy Chipperfield, a former lion tamer turned circus impresario who had recently returned from East Africa with an idea. On April 5th, 1966, the Marquess and Chipperfield opened the Longleat Lion Reserve, the first drive-through safari park outside Africa. 50 lions in a 60-acre enclosure, tourists in their own cars, signs at the gates warning visitors not to wind down their windows. The Bishop of Salisbury wrote a letter to the Times opposing the park on grounds of public morality. The public came in numbers. Within a year, the park was taking more in admissions than the house. Within a decade, it had been expanded to include rhinoceros, giraffes, baboons, hippopotamuses, and a pack of African wild dogs. It had also cost 3 men their fingers, one his eye, and another his life. The head keeper of the safari park between 1966 and 1989 was a Wiltshire man called Edward Pendle, born in 1929 in the village of Horningsham, at the edge of the estate. On the morning of 6th August 1972, Pendle was working alone in the lion enclosure when a young lioness called Rani, hand-reared from a cub and trusted, lunged at his right arm. The bone snapped between elbow and wrist. Pendle was dragged 10 yards before a junior keeper distracted the animal with a length of pipe. He lost 3 fingers, the use of his right hand, and a section of forearm muscle. He was back at work on 27th August 1972, 3 weeks later, in a sling. He worked another 17 years. He died in 1998, in his cottage in Horningsham. The official report into the incident, filed by the estate manager and now in the Wiltshire Record Office, runs to 4 pages. It does not record what Pendle was thinking when he came back to work. By 1980, the safari park was £4 million in debt. The Marquess took out a loan against a Titian and a Veronese and refinanced the debt across 3 banks. The 6th Marquess died on the 30th of June 1992. He had personally opened the front door of Longleat to the first paying visitor in 1949 and the front gate of the safari park to the first paying car in 1966. The son who succeeded him would not be a hotelier or an impresario. The son who succeeded him was something else entirely. His name was Alexander George Thynne, born 6th of May 1932. By 1992, he was already 60 years old. He had been the Viscount Weymouth, courtesy heir, for half his life, and he had spent that half preparing not to be his father. He had read at Christ Church, Oxford, where he had read English. He had served in the Life Guards. He had written and self-published a sequence of novels nobody read. He had grown his hair long. He had dressed in coats of his own design. He had, by his own count by 1992, taken 75 mistresses. He called them wifelets. The system had started in 1969, the year of his marriage to a Hungarian-born actress and journalist called Anna Gail Gyarmathy. The wedding was at the Hungarian embassy in London. Anna was 26. Alexander was 36. Within months of the marriage, Anna had moved to Paris, where she would live for the next 50 years, and Alexander had moved the first wifelet, a Soho model he referred to in interviews as Trudy Jugs, into a cottage on the Longleat estate. The arrangement was understood from the beginning. Anna had what she wanted. Alexander had what he wanted. Each of them appeared at the necessary events. Neither interfered with the other's domestic life. They had 2 children. Ceawlin was born in 1974. His sister Lenka was born in 1969. Both were raised in Paris. The wedding day itself had been peculiar. Anna had worn a silver tunic of her own design. Alexander had worn a coat of crimson velvet trimmed at the cuffs with peacock feathers. The witnesses included a Soho photographer who had not been invited and who had been given a glass of champagne and asked not to publish anything. Within a week of the ceremony, Anna had returned to Paris to resume her career as a foreign correspondent for the French magazine Jour de France. Alexander had returned to Longleat to begin a new private routine. He installed a small painting studio in a corner of the West Wing. He had Trudy Jugs photographed in 7 poses by a Bath photographer called Roger Goodall. He paid the photographer £15 for the prints and instructed him to destroy the negatives, which Goodall did not do, and which are now in the photographic archive of the Victoria Art Gallery in Bath, donated by Goodall's widow in 2011. Between 1969 and 2010, Alexander Thynne lodged at least 75 women in cottages around the Longleat estate. Each had a name, each had a number, each had a small annual retainer, paid through the estate office. Each was invited to the Marquess's birthday parties, which were held in May in the Great Hall, and at which the wifelets would gather in a row, in evening dress, to be introduced to whichever guests had not yet been introduced. The longest-serving wifelet, a former secretary called Rose Hartwell, who went by Lady Rose, lived in a cottage on the estate from 1972 until the day of the Marquess's death in 2020. 48 years. The shortest tenure on record was 11 days. The keeper of the register was George Robbins. Robbins was born in 1939 in the village of Crockerton. He came to Longleat as a footman in 1959 and was promoted to valet of the then Viscount Weymouth in 1965, 6 years before the wifelet system began. He served Alexander Thynne for 55 years, until 2018. He was a small, neat man, in his last years almost bald, who wore a charcoal suit and a club tie, and who never once in 5 decades spoke to the press. The diary he kept, in a bound ledger now in the Longleat Estate Archive, recorded each wifelet by full name, by date of arrival, by date of departure, by the cottage she occupied, by the retainer paid, and by the dates on which she was present at estate events. The diary, which the 8th Marquess of Bath sealed in 2020 for 100 years, contains 75 names. Some of them have never appeared in any other document. Some of them are still alive. In 1971, Alexander Thynne began painting the West Wing. He worked at it for 18 years. The murals he made covered every interior surface of the private wing he had been given as his own apartments, a sequence of 14 rooms culminating in what he called the Bluebeard's bedroom. The murals were explicit. They depicted in 70 separate panels scenes from the Kama Sutra, scenes from his own imagined erotic mythology, scenes from his sexual history with named wifelets reproduced in recognizable likeness on the plaster. The paint was tempera, applied in flat slabs over priming coats. Alexander mixed himself in a small studio off the chapel. By 1989, when he declared the work finished, the West Wing had become the largest single body of explicitly erotic mural painting in England. The sixth Marquess, who was still alive, never went into the West Wing. The housekeeper supervising the weekly scrubbing of the murals between 1957 and 1985 was a woman called Mary Patten, born in 1922 in Frome. She had charge of 3 under-housemaids who washed the walls every Wednesday morning with mild soap and warm water. She referred to them in the housekeeping log now in the estate archive only as the West Wing pictures. She retired in 1985 at the age of 63. She died in 1998. The estate paid the wifelets through a bank account at the Westminster Bank in Warminster, opened in May 1969 and closed in October 2010 on the order of Ceawlin. The annual retainer for a standard wifelet in 1970 was £400. By 2000 it had risen to £3,000. By 2010 it stood at £5,000 for a long-serving wifelet and £1,000 for a recent arrival. The accounts of the estate, which are private, but which were inspected by a court-appointed valuer in 2015 in connection with a separate matter, show a total annual outgoing of just under £80,000 across the wifelet payments at their peak in 2008. The Marquess's allowance from the estate, set against the trust deed of 1992, was £120,000 a year. The wifelet system therefore consumed 2/3 of his disposable income for nearly 40 years. In 2010, the heir came home. Ceawlin Thynne, born June 6, 1974, the Viscount Weymouth, had been raised in Paris by his mother. He had been educated at Bedales and at Oxford. He had worked for 10 years in private equity in London. In 2010, he was 36, recently married with a young son. His relationship with his father had been distant for years. Ceawlin had decided by 2010 that he was going to live at Longleat. He moved his family into the main house. Within 6 months, he had carried out a series of decisions that broke the household his father had built. He banned the wifelets from the estate. He gave each one 90 days to vacate her cottage. The cottages were reclaimed by the estate office and converted into holiday lets. Lady Rose, the longest serving, was permitted to remain in her cottage until her death. Ceawlin barred his father from the main house, restricting him to the West Wing. He cut his father's allowance from the estate. He locked the doors of the Bluebeard's bedroom, and then he ordered the West Wing painted over. The work took 6 months. Most of the murals were covered in a base coat of magnolia and a top coat of cream. Some panels in less visited corridors were preserved untouched. Some panels in the more important rooms were photographed before being covered. The Marquess, who watched the work from a chair in the dining room of his own private apartments, said nothing. The Times reported the painting over on October 14, 2010, as a family matter. The Daily Mail ran a 2-page spread on October 16. Alexander Thynne gave his first public response in an interview with that newspaper on January the 22nd, 2014. Asked what he thought of his son's decisions, the Marquess replied, "I would not call it inheritance. I would call it Stalinist." The line ran on every front page in Britain the following morning. He had said more than that. To the Times in 2012 he had said, "I have known 75 women in my time. They are not mistresses, they are wifelets. I love each of them, and they love me." To his own biographer in 2014 he said, "The house is mine. My son lives in it." My son has misunderstood the difference. To his Paris-based wife Anna, asked by a French magazine the same year, she said only, "He is who he is. I knew this before I married him." The 8th Marquess, asked by the Telegraph in 2014 why he had painted over the murals, gave a one-line reply that was as cool as his father's was warm. "I would not have my children walk past those murals every morning," he said. "They had to go." The breach was complete by 2015. Father and son did not speak. The cottages around the estate were full of holiday let bookings. The Bluebeard's bedroom was sealed. Trudy Juggs, the first wifelet of 1969, had returned to Soho and was untraceable by 2014. Lady Rose remained in her cottage, alone, watching the woods. On the 8th of June 2013, Ceawlin married Emma McQuiston in the chapel of Longleat. Emma was 26. She had been born in Lagos to a Nigerian mother and an English father. She was the first mixed-race marchioness in English history. Alexander Thynne declined to attend the ceremony. He gave no reason in writing. The Daily Mail covered the rift extensively. The seventh Marquess, asked by a reporter the following year whether his absence had been related to his daughter-in-law's race, denied it with an emphasis that the journalist found, in print, unpersuasive. The breach widened. Ceawlin's younger brother, Lord Christopher Thynne, the colourful one, the man acquitted in 1992 of stealing £150,000 of family jewels, did attend the wedding. He died in 2017. On April 4th, 2020, Alexander Thynne, the seventh Marquess of Bath, was admitted to the Royal United Hospital in Bath with a confirmed case of COVID-19. He died that afternoon at the age of 87. Lockdown was in force. The funeral was held 5 days later at the small parish church of Longbridge Deverill, where his ancestor Sir John Thynne had been buried in 1580. The order of service permitted 7 mourners. Anna Gale flew from Paris. Ceawlin attended with his wife. The children of his sister Lenka came. George Robins, the valet who had served the Marquess for 55 years and who had kept the diary, was not permitted to attend due to the limit. He watched the coffin pass the gates of the estate from a window in his cottage. He died 8 months later. The Konigsmark murder of 1682 had altered the male line. The wifelets and the murals had altered the inheritance. The diary in the estate archive, sealed for a century by the 8th Marquess, would alter nothing now. The 7th Marquess was buried beneath a slab in the family vault. Above him, on the church wall, his ancestor Thomas of 10,000 has a small marble plaque recording his death by murder on February 12th, 1682. The two slabs are 11 feet apart. But the house that astonishes the 700,000 visitors who arrive each year was not built by the 7 men who held the title of Marquess of Bath, nor by the assassin Vratz, nor by the Count who hired him, nor by the architect Smythson, nor by the steward Thynne, whose name is carved into the cornerstone. The house was built and rebuilt and scrubbed and painted and unpainted by people whose names do not appear on the official guidebook. Presence at Longleat is documented, recorded in ink on paper, in account books and pay ledgers and weekly timesheets in the estate office. Their stories are not. There was a valet called George Robins, born in 1939 in Crockerton, 2 miles from the gate. He came to Longleat in 1959 as a footman, earning £7 a week and his keep, and he was raised to the position of valet of Viscount Weymouth in February 1965. He served Alexander Thynne for 55 years. He laid out his master's coats every morning in the dressing room of the West Wing, including the velvet coats Alexander had designed himself in colours that frightened his tailor. He maintained the wifelet diary in his small, precise hand from 1969 until the day in 2010 that Ceawlin took the ledger from him and locked it in the estate archive. He was pensioned off in 2018 at the age of 79. He was allowed to keep his cottage on Heaven's Gate Lane. He never gave an interview. We know he had a wife called Margaret who predeceased him by 20 years. We know he had a brother in Frome whom he visited every Christmas. We know he died of a stroke in November 2020, 8 months after his master. We know nothing else. There was a housekeeper called Mary Patton, born in Frome in 1922, who took up her position at Longleat on 1st September 1957 and held it for 28 years. Her wage in 1957 was £4.10 a week with board, raised by 1985 to a salary of £7,200 a year. She supervised 11 housemaids. She kept a household log which entered the work done in each of the public rooms each day. From 1971 onwards, after the West Wing was given over to the murals, she supervised every Wednesday morning the cleaning of the painted walls with mild soap and warm water. She referred to the work in the log now in the estate archive only as the West Wing pictures. She retired in 1985. She died in 1998 in a care home in Trowbridge. We know she had no children. We know she had a younger sister called Edna who outlived her by 4 years. We know nothing else. There was a headkeeper at the safari park called Edward Pendle, born in 1929 in Horningsham, the village at the eastern edge of the park. He was appointed in April 1966, 3 weeks before the gates opened, on a wage of £9 a week and a cottage at the back of the lion enclosure. He served as headkeeper for 23 years. On the morning of August 6, 1972, he was attacked by a lioness called Rani in the lion enclosure. He lost 3 fingers and the use of his right hand. He returned to work on 27 August 1972, 21 days after the injury. He retired in 1989 at the age of 60. We know he had 3 children. We know one of them, his son David, became a junior keeper at Longleat in 1985 and is still on the staff. We know nothing else. They appear in the records as footnotes, a name beside a sum. A weekly wage entered into a bound ledger, a duty discharged on a Wednesday morning, and then they vanish into the silence that swallows everyone in a great house who is not a member of the family. George Robins kept the diary that no historian will read for another 94 years. Mary Patten scrubbed the walls that one Marquess painted and another Marquess covered. Edward Pendle came back to work 21 days after a lioness took 3 of his fingers because there was a safari park to run and a family to feed. We know only that they were there, that the house they served is still standing, and that their names survived, some of them, because the Thynn estate office kept its accounts since 1574, and nobody threw the ledgers away. The house absorbed them. The house absorbed everything. The 8th Marquess of Bath runs Longleat now. He is 51. He and his wife Emma have 2 sons, John and Henry. The boys are being raised in the same nursery that Alexander and Ceawlin and Henry VI Marquess were raised in. They are not being raised in Paris. The staterooms have been reopened to the public. The wifelet cottages converted to holiday lets. The safari park rebranded as a conservation programme. In 2014, Ceawlin commissioned a restoration of the Italian gardens at a cost of £1 million. In 2016, he opened the Longleat Festival of Light, an annual exhibition of Chinese silk lanterns that runs from November to January and that draws 300,000 additional visitors a year. He has appeared with Emma on the ITV programme Animal Park, which has filmed at Longleat continuously since 2000 and which is now in its 26th series. The total annual visitor number to Longleat, the house and the safari park combined is 700,000. The annual operating cost of the estate is in the region of £25 million. The estate is profitable in a good year by a margin of less than 5%. The 8th Marquess has spoken publicly about the precariousness of running an English country house in the 21st century. He has spoken less publicly about his father. In 2022, 2 years after Alexander's death, the official Longleat tour was modified. The West Wing remained closed to the public, but on the tour route, a small interpretation panel was added in a corridor leading off the Great Hall that acknowledges the existence of the murals and offers a photograph of one of them, a Krishna panel of the south wall, partially preserved beneath a layer of magnolia that had cracked and lifted. The panel does not name Trudy Juggs or Lady Rose. The panel does not name George Robins. The panel records only that the 7th Marquess had decorated his private apartments in the late 20th century and that those apartments had been altered after 2010 by his successor. The photograph is small. Most visitors walk past it. The Bluebeard's bedroom is still sealed. The murals beneath the magnolia are still there. They have not been removed. They have only been covered. Conservation reports commissioned by the Thynne estate in 2018, written by a Bath-based wall paintings conservator called Susan McFarlane, and now held in the estate archive in a folder marked simply West Wing 2018, noted that the paint Alexander used in 1971 was unusually durable, of a heavy tempera mix with linseed binder and a high pigment loading, and that the magnolia covering, which had been applied in a single thin coat of standard emulsion in October 2010, would given 100 years and a little neglect almost certainly crack and flake to reveal the 70 panels beneath. The report also noted that in 3 corners of the Bluebeard's bedroom, the magnolia had already begun to separate from the underlying tempera, and that intervention would shortly become necessary if the covering was to be preserved. Some restorers have already proposed, in private, that the murals should be uncovered for documentary purposes. The 8th Marquess has not responded to those proposals. He has said only to a reporter from The Telegraph in 2023 that the house belongs now to his children, and that his children will decide. Stand at the south front of Longleat on a November afternoon. Stand at the south front of Longleat on a November afternoon, and the building is the longest unbroken Elizabethan facade in England. 96 windows of identical size, 3 stories of golden Bath ashlar, set in a valley engineered by Capability Brown to make the house look like the conclusion of the landscape rather than its imposition. It is the first true prodigy house. It is the prototype of every great country house that came after. It is the architectural answer to a question English builders had not previously known how to ask. And then look closer, and you see that the stone of the South Range has been recut in 3 places where the original courses had decayed, and the lower windows are slightly larger than the upper, and the central balustrade was added in the 18th century and replaced in the 20th, and bears a faint horizontal stain where rain has run down it since 1972. And on the west side, the magnolia paint of a sealed wing has lifted at a corner to show very faintly a single brushstroke of red beneath the cream. Longleat is not one house. It is the record in Bath stone and Tudor glass and 20th century scaffolding of every decision that English aristocracy has been forced to make about wealth and survival in the 459 years since the stones were first laid. Sir John Thynne wanted a monument to a fortune he had taken from dissolved monasteries. The house gave him the longest facade in England. Thomas Thynne wanted Elizabeth Percy and an heiress's fortune. The house gave him 3 slugs from a blunderbuss on Pall Mall and a marble plaque beside his ancestor's grave. The 6th Marquess wanted a way to keep the house solvent. The house gave him 50 lions in a 60-acre enclosure and the man who lost 3 fingers running them. Alexander Thynne wanted 75 wifelets and 70 panels of his own painting on his own walls. The house gave him the cottages and the west wing, and a register kept by a valet who never spoke. Ceawlin wanted a house his children could walk through. The house gave him a coat of magnolia and a sealed room and a year of front pages. The house gave them all what they asked of it, in the careful, expensive, neutral manner of a great country house accustomed to absorbing human weather. The house always gives. That is its genius, and that is its cost. All of this is a kind of curated memory. The house decides what to show and what to hide, what to paint over and what to keep, what to seal and what to open. The 8th Marquess and his wife have made one set of decisions. The 7th Marquess and his valet made another. Sir John Thynne, in 1580, made the first set when he chose not to put on the cornerstone of his new house the words from a dissolved priory or the name of the patron who had taken him to the Tower. Every Marquess in between has had his own quiet edit to make. The house has carried them all. George Robins kept the diary that names every wifelet by date and cottage. Mary Patton scrubbed the painted walls every Wednesday morning for 14 years and recorded the work as the West Wing pictures. Edward Pendle came back to work 21 days after a lioness called Rani took 3 of his fingers. None of them appears on the interpretation panel in the corridor off the Great Hall. None of them has a marble plaque in the parish church. The diary kept by Robins is in a sealed cabinet in the estate archive and will not be opened until 2120 by direction of the 8th Marquess of Bath. The housekeeping log kept by Patton is in the same archive on open shelves. The 4-page report into the lioness attack on Pendle is in the Wiltshire Record Office. Most visitors will never know they existed. Who does a building belong to? To Sir John Thynne, who built it in 1580 with money taken from dissolved monasteries, to Thomas Thynne, who was murdered before he could inherit it in 1682, to the Marquess, who opened it to paying visitors in 1949, or to the Marquess, who turned its gardens into a safari park in 1966, to Alexander, who painted 70 explicit panels across its private walls, to Ceawlin, who covered them over in 2010 and married the first mixed-race marchioness in English history in 2013, to Emma, who lives there now with 2 boys, to the 700,000 visitors who file through the staterooms each year and look at the gilt and the paintings and the portraits and the carved chimney pieces, to George Robins, who served the building and the man who lived in it for 55 years and is now 18 months in his grave, or to the 75 women named in his diary, 4 of whom are still alive in their 70s and 80s, in cottages of their own, in towns whose names the public will not learn for 94 more years. Longleat does not answer. The house never answers. It simply stands in its valley, in the same 9,000 acres of capability brown parkland, with the same fallow deer at the edge of the wood, and lets you decide. There is a small corner of the West Range, on the second floor of what used to be the Bluebeard's bedroom, where a corner of the magnolia paint has begun, very slowly, to lift away from the plaster beneath. If you stood close to it, in the light of a November afternoon, with permission to be in a room that no public visitor is permitted to enter, you would see a faint brushstroke of red. It belongs to a 1971 panel. It is a fragment of the work of a man who wanted to be remembered for the wrong things, and has been remembered for them. The conservator who noted the lift in 2018 wrote in her report that the magnolia would not hold beyond a century. The wifelets in George Robins's diary, locked in their cabinet, have 100 years to wait before their names are read. The brush stroke of red has roughly the same. They are still down there. They always will be. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see a building differently, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me which estate, dynasty, or hidden history we should investigate next. There are hundreds of these stories waiting to be told, and every one of them is hiding something beneath the surface.